Good day. Today is Wednesday, 30th April 2025. Now, over course of my last couple of programs, I have been devoting a huge amount of time to discussing the state of the negotiations, the peace plans or initiatives pushed by the United States, the contrary plans pushed by the European Union and the Ukrainians, the various responses of the Russians, and that sort of thing. It has been grueling work, and I accept that in some cases my programs have gone over the same ground several times. But over the course of these programs, I have suggested a number of things. Firstly, that the American plan, Kellogg Plus or Kellogg Minus, whichever you prefer to call it, the plan which was rejected outright by President Zelensky over the course of last week and which caused a collective blast of horror from the European leadership. I suggested that plan was anyway in its existing form unworkable, since there was no possibility at all that as it stood, the Russians would accept it. Whilst it did, from a Russian perspective, mark a shift from the original Kellogg plan, it did seem to recognize some Russian concerns. It didn't go anywhere far enough, but that the Russians might accept it as a starting point for discussions. I also said that what I thought was likely to have happened, and I've said this in several programs, was that Witkoff, taking the new American plan with him to Moscow, meeting Putin on Friday, would have pressed Putin to accept the plan, to agree that the Ukrainians should retain control of those parts of the four regions of which they are still in possession, and should agree forthwith to an unconditional ceasefire on the line of control. I've said this in various programs, and I said also that to Donald Trump's obvious disappointment and perhaps surprise, Putin almost certainly, in fact undoubtedly, rejected this proposal. He rejected the idea of a ceasefire on the current line of control. He continued to insist not just that the remaining territory of the four regions be transferred to Russia, but that all of the other points set out in his speech to the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry, of 14th June 2024 should be agreed in full. Not just Ukraine remaining outside NATO, but Ukraine becoming a fully neutral country again, a neutral and non-aligned country. The last, by the way, is not exactly the same as neutral, but I'm not going to discuss the details of all of that today. Also, restrictions, significant, very tight restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, the prohibition of deployment of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory without Russian agreement, protections for the rights of Russian speakers on the territory of Ukraine itself, or whatever territory Ukraine continues to retain after the conflict, the restoration of the Russian Orthodox Church, the liquidation of the influence of the ideology of the 1930s, as I euphemistically refer to it, on Ukrainian territory. And, by the way, something that many people overlook, the denuclearization of Ukraine. In other words, steps taken to prevent Ukraine at any time in the future acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, this was what Putin discussed, the stated objectives of the special military operation when the special military operation was launched back in February 2022. He restated all of those in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. He pointed out that in large part, in fact almost entirely, Ukraine accepted all of these points in the Istanbul agreement that was almost agreed or basically agreed following the negotiations in April 2022, save that at the time of that agreement, Ukraine was not required to recognize the territories that Russia controlled in the Donbass or Crimea as being outside Ukraine. In other words, was not required to recognize these territories as Russian. But in all other respects, in nearly all other respects, Istanbul Plus, as I have referred to it, went very far towards meeting Putin's objectives as set out at the start of the special military operation, and that he has never shown the slightest willingness or interest in retreating from that position. So I said that that was almost certainly what Putin would have said to Witkoff on Friday. And I have also said in my previous programs that what Putin did say, however, to Witkoff is that Kellogg Minus, if we can call it that, the plan that Witkoff brought with him to Moscow and which was presented to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans over the course of the talks in Paris and London last week, could nonetheless serve as a basis for future discussion, and that the point had now come for Russia and Ukraine to begin direct negotiations again, or rather to resume direct negotiations which Ukraine basically walked out of in April 2022 and prohibited itself from conducting further by Zelensky's decree of October 2022, but of which the Russians have repeatedly said they are ready to engage in. They have never, as they repeatedly point out, ruled out negotiations, even whilst Zelensky remains, as they would say, de facto president of Ukraine, though, as the Russians have also made clear, they don't recognize his legitimacy as president of Ukraine. So I said that this is what I thought Putin would have said to Witkoff, and I further pointed out that the fact that Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, has said that over the course of the meeting with Witkoff, Putin repeatedly pointed out that Russia is prepared for direct negotiations with Ukraine, suggested that there had been a disagreement and perhaps even an argument, with perhaps Witkoff, under instructions from Trump, continuing to push for a ceasefire on the existing line of control. That was what I have been saying over the last couple of days. Well, we now have an article in Bloomberg, and it says exactly this, that what I have been saying over the last couple of days is exactly correct. It gives an account of the meeting between Witkoff and Putin on Friday, which is in full accord exactly with what I had previously inferred. And this is the article. It's Putin said to demand Ukraine land despite US pressure. And it's dated 29th April 2025. It came out yesterday, shortly after I made yesterday's video. And it goes on to say this: President Putin is insisting that Russia must take control of 4 regions of Ukraine it doesn't fully occupy as part of any agreement to end his war, according to 3 people in Moscow familiar with the matter. The demand deals a blow to US President Donald Trump's effort to reach a ceasefire and a permanent end to the war, amid mounting frustration in the White House about a lack of progress in negotiations. Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff sought to persuade Putin that Russia should agree to a ceasefire that halts fighting along the current front lines during lengthy talks at the Kremlin on Friday, according to 2 of the people who asked not to be identified discussing sensitive issues. Instead, the Russian leader maintained his maximalist position on territory. Negotiations have reached an impasse for now, and it requires direct contact between Putin and Trump to make further progress, one of the people said. And then the article goes on to say that Peskov was asked for comments and he refused, and so did US National Security Council spokesman James Hewitt. Now, it's always tempting when one gets an article like this, which is exactly in line with what one already believes to be true, to assume that this article actually is true. Now, I say that because that is a very, very common mistake. People are always willing to believe what is presented to them as evidence, which confirms their own beliefs. I have one concern about this article from Bloomberg, and that is that it claims that it's obtained this information from 3 people in Moscow familiar with the matter. Now, these are not 3 people in Washington familiar with the matter, but these are 3 people in Moscow familiar with the matter. Who in Moscow actually familiar with the discussions between Putin and Witkoff is then going to hurry along to Bloomberg and tell Bloomberg, well, this is what we know, this is what actually happened when Putin and Witkoff met on Friday. So that is a major question mark over this article. I have to say that I find this perennial habit of relying on these anonymous sources that so much of the media, especially the American media, indulges in, completely frustrating. Having said that, this article is not only consistent with my beliefs, it is also fully consistent with everything that the Russians have been saying over the last couple of days. Both the interview that Lavrov gave to Face the Nation on Thursday before the meeting with Witkoff. Secondly, the interview that Lavrov gave to the Brazilian newspaper O Globo directly after Putin's meeting with Witkoff, and of course further comments that have been made by people like Patrushev and Peskov himself. And on that topic, Peskov has, of course, been talking today. And this is what Peskov said. The negotiation process is in progress. President Putin's primary goal is to achieve the objectives he set when launching the special military operation. We must safeguard our national interests. Is it preferable to reach these goals preferably, peacefully? Yes. But then he went on to say that Putin initially attempted to pursue these objectives through peaceful means before the start of the operation, but his initiatives were rejected. After that, now we go back to this quote, these are direct quotes, this is all from TASS, by the way. There was no alternative left but to address these objectives by military means through the special military operation. And though Peskov, we're told by TASS, said that Russia remains open to political and diplomatic resolution, the clear implication is that if the objectives can only be achieved by continuing with the special military operation, that is by military means, then so be it. So, again, to repeat, and this is TASS's gloss, attaining all the objectives of the special military operation remains for Russia a top priority. And that's how TASS, not me, and TASS is Russia's official news agency, interprets these words of Peskov. And I cannot see that they can be interpreted, in fact, in any different way. So, with the massive caveat that I have some queries about how Bloomberg obtained its information, I believe for once that its article is exactly true. I'm going to make a further guess that the article actually is the product of a strategic leak decided on by someone in the Kremlin, probably with Putin's approval. There have been concerns in the Kremlin, especially following that Financial Times article which appeared last week about suggesting that the Russians were in fact prepared to stop fighting along the existing contact line, that impressions were circulating that the Russians were softening their position. And so a decision was made to talk to Bloomberg off the record to get this article appear in Bloomberg, which made it quite clear that this was not the case at all, and that Putin's position remains, as he has said, as Russian officials like Lavrov, Patrushev, Peskov, Shoigu, and others have said, one and the same as the position that he set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June last year. So there it is. Now, I think logically this must bury completely the Financial Times article. The Financial Times, the day before yesterday, published an article which I've discussed in earlier programs, also saying that people in Europe were beginning to fear that Trump was preparing to walk away from the negotiations because President Putin is not prepared to soften his demands, soften his stance. And that, as I pointed out when I discussed that Financial Times article, also suggests implicitly that that earlier Financial Times article about Putin supposedly being willing to stop the Russian army's advance along the existing contact line was wrong. I think it's time, by the way, that the editors of the Financial Times made a statement to that effect, that maybe they published that article in good faith, but it was clearly wrong. Sometimes one gets information, sometimes that information is provided sincerely, sometimes it is deliberate misdirection on the part of who provides it, sometimes one gets information which is wrong, in which case one should admit this. I will give an example where I have done, well, something like that. In discussing the massive missile strike on Kiev recently, the one that Donald Trump complained about in two separate Truth Social posts. Anyway, in discussing that article, I mentioned that a report was circulating. I didn't say that the report was true, but I mentioned that a report was circulating that the Russian missiles had destroyed a major command bunker located on Kreshetik, the major street, thoroughfare in the middle of Kiev, that the bunker had been destroyed and that a lot of Ukrainian top personnel had been killed in this strike, and that some Westerners were also in that bunker as well. Well, since then, at the Duran, we've been contacted by somebody who is physically present in Kiev at the moment. This individual has said that he is familiar with the layout of Kreshetik. He knows for a fact that there is actually no such bunker beneath Kreshetik, and that he walked along Kreshetik after the missile strike and saw no damage there at all. So those reports that were circulating about the destruction of the bunker underneath Kreshetik were clearly wrong. So is that article about Putin agreeing to stop at the contact line. That clearly is also wrong. I am happy to confirm that the information that I saw, those reports that I mentioned in this program, are wrong. I think the Financial Times should do the same in relation to the far more consequential and far more influential article which they published. I do not doubt their good faith in publishing it, but clearly the information was wrong, and it's time to simply say that the information provided that Putin was prepared to stop the advance on the contact line was wrong also. If one understands that, then everything that we are seeing play out at the moment makes sense. Donald Trump has been frustrated at both sides. He was advised by various people right at the beginning of his presidency, and indeed before his presidency, even during the election campaign, people like Keith Kellogg, to focus on obtaining a ceasefire. That was his primary objective. That was what Marco Rubio set out to achieve. That was what the original Kellogg plan was all about. The idea was a ceasefire followed by negotiations, something which would have frozen the conflict pretty much indefinitely. Now, as we have pointed out on the Duran, as I have pointed out in many programs, as Eve Smith, by the way, pointed out in several articles on naked capitalism, as many others have pointed out too, this idea of a temporary ceasefire, or at least a ceasefire whilst negotiations were underway, is something which the Russians have consistently refused. They have said constantly, repeatedly, that they are not prepared to agree a ceasefire unless and until the actual causes of the war have been addressed, so that there is at least a framework structure to move forward with, so that a ceasefire becomes meaningful. The Russians have repeatedly pointed out that in the past, when there have been ceasefires prior to negotiations, all that has led to is the Ukrainians indefinitely spinning up the ceasefire whilst they rearmed and reorganized, putting the Russians in a worse military position than the one in which they had been before. So, given that was the Russian stance, it was inevitable that they would reject the ceasefire. They'd already made it clear before Donald Trump was even elected that is what they would do. They repeated that after his election victory. They continued to repeat that throughout the discussions that took place afterwards. Putin made some move in respect of a ceasefire when he said, well, look, since you're so fixed on a ceasefire, yes, we will at least entertain the idea, provided you can guarantee that no more military aid and intelligence assistance to Ukraine will be provided. The United States was not prepared to do that. The Europeans, of course, reject that proposal outright, so that the entire idea of a ceasefire fell apart the moment it was first proposed. And it was bound that that would happen. And Kellogg Minus, which does at least go some way to, as I said, responding to Russian concerns, and does finally begin to address the root causes of the war, is still so ambivalent and so vague and tentative that, again, it was inconceivable that the Russians would accept it as sufficient to agree a ceasefire. Now, I say all of this. There is, of course, a contrary view. An article has appeared in the Times, and it's not the only such article, by the way, but it's an article which has been written by Roger Boyes. The Times is diplomatic editor, I believe. At least he writes about foreign policy, and he has done so for many years. And I should say he's a serious journalist. I don't always agree with him. Anyway, but he is a serious journalist and somebody who often brings great insight to what he writes. And he makes this claim. He says those negotiations, the negotiations which have been underway over the last couple of weeks, began by treating a political settlement as the goal and working backwards towards a ceasefire. Russia felt empowered to make political demands from the start, caps on the size of the Ukrainian army, changes in its constitution, all as a humiliating precondition for peace. Now that's what Roger Boyes says, that in fact Trump didn't actually call for a ceasefire at the outset. He actually went straight in seeking a political settlement. I don't understand that, because I don't think that there is any evidence for this in the actual events of the last 100 days. It seems to me absolutely clear. In fact, I don't see that there is any doubt about it at all, that it was, in fact, a ceasefire, not a political settlement of the conflict that Trump was seeking. Anyway, the next sentence in Roger Boyes' article, to my mind, gives the game away, because we're told that a certain individual, a certain well-known individual, has suggested that better to use the model of 1950s Korea, prioritize an armistice and treat a political settlement as a separate process that can take years of strategic patience to bear fruit. By the way, can I just say on that, people talk about the Korean settlement. Well, it's provided a kind of tense peace on the Korean peninsula, but can we say that that approach has borne fruit? We now have a nuclear-powered North Korea, seen by many people in the United States and amongst the US's East Asian allies as potentially a dangerous threat. A North Korea that is now closely allied with Russia and has fought alongside the Russian army on Russian territory in Kursk region. I'm not sure quite how that bore fruit. But anyway, the point is that that was, in fact, exactly, it seems to me, what Kellogg was trying to do. trying to use the model of 1950s Korea, prioritizing an armistice and treating the political settlement as a separate process that might take years of strategic patience to bear fruit. That was actually, in truth, the framework that Trump was following. And who was it who suggests this approach? Well, Roger Boyce tells us the person who suggested it was none other than Aaron West Mitchell, the same person who wrote that article back in August 2021 in National Interest, the man who suggested that the right way forward to try to break the alliance of Russia and China, the strategic partnership of Russia and China, was to engineer the defeat of Russia in a conflict in Ukraine, thereby enabling the United States to gain control of Russian foreign policy. So that person who provided what I suspect was the framework of the conflict in Ukraine that followed, that played out and has played out over the last 4 years, that same person, Mr. West Mitchell, is the same person who is talking about a Korean-style armistice in this particular conflict. Now, I would say, and I want to stress this, that in fact, we are not talking about the Korean-style armistice that was actually agreed in 1954, which ended the conflict in Korea. That is, as is so often the case, actually very different from the kind of armistice that Mr. Boyce and Mr. West Mitchell imagine. There were lots of other aspects to the Korean conflict. I'm not going to waste time discussing the Korean conflict in this program. All I am saying is that this formula, this use of the Korean conflict and the armistice there, to basically say that the objective should be a frozen conflict, because that is what that would amount to. That was not the objective, it seems to me, of the negotiators in Korea, of the armistice in Korea. It was very definitely envisaged that there would be a political solution, and all sorts of things happened which took things in a different direction thereafter. But I'm not going to discuss any of that in this program. What Mr. West Mitchell wants is a frozen conflict. What Kellogg wants is a frozen conflict, a conflict in which the Russians would then be put permanently on the back foot, over the course of which Ukraine would be rearmed, and which might in time lead Ukraine to join NATO. What the Russians want is the diametric opposite, and for that reason there was never the ghost of a chance that they would agree to what Kellogg, Mr. West Mitchell and others have been demanding. Now, just to say, over the last couple of hours, the Russian foreign minister has also been speaking. Mr. Lavrov has said that the reason there is suddenly this enormous interest in the West in getting a ceasefire, why the Ukrainians, who previously vigorously opposed a ceasefire, have now embraced the idea of a ceasefire, is because Ukraine is losing on the battlefields. Suddenly, that which was unacceptable before has now become the desired outcome, and the fact that the Russians are refusing to agree to it is proof that the Ukrainians want peace and that the Russians don't. Well, he's right, actually. Maybe not completely right, because the Ukrainians clearly do see, the Americans clearly, I think, were not, Trump at least, was not really looking at a ceasefire quite in that way. But essentially he is right. If it were not the case that the Russians were winning the war, if it actually were the case that the US-led coalition were winning the war, we would not now be talking about a ceasefire. If, for example, the summer 2023 offensive had been successful, the Ukrainian offensive of summer 2023 had been successful, then we can be absolutely sure that Western demands would not be for a ceasefire on the existing contact lines. They would have been for a total Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. In other words, for demands not that different, in a sense, from the ones that the Russians are making now, which is for the Ukrainians to pull out of the territory they still control in the 4 regions. Just saying. So anyway, this is where we are. Now what happens next? Well, there is no sign of any movement at all in the diplomacy. The Russians made their position completely clear when Witkoff met Putin. I think Witkoff warned Trump before he was sent to meet Putin that this is what Putin would say. Witkoff had, after all, had, I believe, 3 meetings with Putin before. Putin had gone to great lengths to set out the Russian position then. We also learned from Bloomberg that there was a discussion in front of Trump in which Witkoff explained Putin's position and explained to Trump that the transfer of the 4 regions to Russia was one of Putin's fundamental conditions and that it was the best way to end the war quickly. Kellogg predictably pushed back. He insisted that this was unacceptable to the Ukrainians and for that reason could not be agreed to. Trump was unable to make a decision, but eventually it's clear he came round to Kellogg's thinking, sent off Witkoff to Moscow with, as I said, what is in essence Kellogg's proposal, and then Witkoff came back with Putin's no, which is what he warned Trump in advance he would come back with. So there is no further movement from the Russian side. But the Russians have said that they're prepared to agree to direct talks with the Ukrainians. Now, I believe that Trump told Zelensky when they met in Rome that Zelensky should get on and start direct talks with the Russians. The Ukrainians have made no such move. They continue to refuse all negotiations with the Russians. They continue to demand more and more sanctions on Russia. They've been doing this continuously. There's an article in the British media today by Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, which takes a completely unyielding position, not just on the subject of talks, but continues to insist that there should be no question of lifting the sanctions on air links against Russia. The mutual ban of air links, the arrival of Russian civil aviation in Western cities, and of course the Russians counteracted to that by imposing their own ban on Western airline flights, not just to Russia, but over Russian territory, putting Western air carriers at a severe disadvantage relative to East Asian air carriers. Anyway, even that very simple sanctions, the lifting of which would undoubtedly improve the atmosphere between Russia and the West and between Russia and the United States, but which would not fundamentally water down the sanctions regime which is currently in place. Even that small thing, small but symbolic and important thing and humane thing Yermak opposes. He comes up, by the way, with an incredibly involved and convoluted argument that Russian civilian airlines somehow are part of the Russian military system, so that allowing Russian tourists to fly to London to do shopping there somehow is going to assist Putin's war machine. I'm not going to waste time debunking that preposterous claim, but anyway, that is what Yermak says. If you want to read it, read his article and see his argument in full. You can waste your time and track it down. Anyway, moving on. No sign that the Ukrainians are prepared to budge on the question of talks. Notice that in all the time that negotiations with the Russians have been floated, the idea of negotiations with the Russians have been floated, Zelensky has never wavered on his refusal to rescind his October 2022 decree, which in effect prohibits negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. He has said at various times that if there is the kind of unconditional ceasefire that he is insisting on, then negotiations might occur. But I noticed that he has never actually said that even in that event he would rescind his October 2022 decree. So the Russians won't agree a ceasefire. They insist on negotiations. The Ukrainians won't agree to negotiations, probably at all, but they insist on a ceasefire. The Russians want a settlement of the conflict. The Ukrainians want a freeze of the conflict, something which in 2023 and much of 2024 they categorically rejected. But they want a freeze of the conflict now because they are losing the war. And they're not just losing the war, they know that US military aid is about to end. Now, that brings us, as I've said in many programs, to the point where Donald Trump needs to make certain very important decisions going forward, because he must now understand that neither side, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, are going to shift from their positions. It is inconceivable that the Russians will. It is equally inconceivable that the Ukrainians will do so either. Trump could, in theory, do a deal with the Russians over the heads of the Europeans and the Ukrainians and then impose it on the Ukrainians. But he has shown no interest in taking that step so far, though, by the way, it is absolutely in US power to do it. But he's shown, as I said, no interest in doing it. And probably he fears that were he to proceed in that way, it would provoke a split within his administration. And, well, frankly, he seems out of ideas. So he's talked about walking away. And given where we are, given what Bloomberg describes as the impasse that we are in, I don't see any way forward. Now, Bloomberg says that one of the three people that it spoke to in Moscow has floated the possibility that a meeting between Trump and Putin, or at least a discussion between Trump and Putin, might be the way to break through the impasse. The implication being, I suppose, that if Trump put pressure on Putin in a one-to-one discussion, then Putin might bend and might start making concessions over territory and that sort of thing. What is the evidence of this? Trump telephoned Putin. demanded that Putin agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. And as I've discussed in previous programs, Putin basically said no. Trump brought up the topic of the grain deal, the so-called Black Sea Initiative. Putin said, by all means, let's try to revive it. But as became clear in the talks between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh, Putin again is not prepared to give ground on the position that he basically agreed to when the grain agreement, the grain deal, was first agreed back in the summer of 2022. So what reason is there for thinking that a further conversation or meeting between Trump and Putin is going to cause Putin to shift ground? Now, here is what I believe is going to happen. I have discussed this in many places. Trump has made a number of comments over the last 24 hours about whether he's prepared to send any weapons, any further weapons to Ukraine. And he has made it absolutely clear, as far as I can see, that he is not going to do so. So the delivery of weapons to Ukraine from this moment on by the United States looks likely as if it is going to end. There's going to be no more deliveries of weapons from the United States to Ukraine. Intelligence sharing, Donald Trump has said absolutely nothing about. I am going to make a guess that that is going to continue. I think that the United States will continue to provide intelligence information about Russian positions to Ukraine. It doesn't cost the United States very much. Stopping intelligence sharing with Ukraine, cutting off Starlink, doing those sort of things would lead not just to a faster Ukrainian military collapse, but inevitably to accusations that it was Donald Trump's actions in interrupting intelligence sharing and in cutting off Starlink that had brought that collapse about. So again, I don't think Donald Trump is going to do it. So no more weapons to Ukraine, but perhaps continued intelligence sharing. And of course, Ukraine can continue to use the Starlink system. So that, I think, is what Trump is going to do. Now, there are reports that later today, Ukraine and the United States will finally sign the mineral rights extraction deal. The Ukrainians are claiming that they've obtained concessions from the United States. The concession that is being talked about is that the United States is apparently not saying any longer, or at least the text of the agreement no longer says that the mineral rights extraction agreement is intended to repay the United States for the support the United States has already previously given to Ukraine. Now, on the face of it, and I've said this already, that looks like an empty concession by the Ukrainians. If the remainder of the deal, the proposed deal, is the same as it was. Because, to remind everyone, the draft of the mineral rights extraction deal, the revised draft, speaks of an indefinite arrangement between Ukraine and the United States, with the United States obtaining vast receipts from development in Ukraine and doing so indefinitely. So given that this is going to be an indefinite thing, I really don't see what repayment of an older debt has to do with it. I mean, the United States is going to get its money one way or the other. You can argue that the first 100 billion was to repay a debt, or the first $350 billion was to repay a debt, but it doesn't look as if further, at the end of the day, given, as I said, that the payments are going to continue indefinitely, it fundamentally no longer matters. I suspect that if the Americans have made this concession, Donald Trump is rationalizing it by saying that the United States is going to get its money back because it's not going to provide further military aid to Ukraine, which is what he has in effect stated. We will have to see the Mineral Rights Extraction Agreement, the actual text. Apparently, what is being signed is, again, a kind of pre-contract document if it's going to be signed today, because we're told that there's going to be more technical discussions over the next few weeks about setting up the joint fund and all of that kind of thing. But given that the war looks likely to continue, as even Donald Trump must realize, this is a meaningless scrap of paper which cannot be effective in any way, because whilst the war is ongoing, none of its provisions can take effect. So anyway, looks like he's managed to get that from the Ukrainians at least. They're putting their signature to the document. It may be a bit different from what we were previously led to think. We will just have to find out. So that's the first, that's one thing that probably we're going to see over the next couple of days. So no more weapons to Ukraine, but a mineral rights extraction agreement with Ukraine. Now, Trump has again taken to talking about further sanctions against the Russians. He does so, I've noticed, with very little enthusiasm, but I suspect that though it would be a mistake to do it, and I think deep down he knows it, probably when he pulls away, he stops providing Ukraine with weapons, he imposes more sanctions against Russia. Now, these might be the bone-crushing sanctions that Lindsey Graham has been talking about, or it could be milder sanctions that Donald Trump has in mind. I've already said that some of the sanctions that are being spoken about, the sanctions, the banking sanctions, for example, make no sense given that essentially the entire Russian financial system is subject to sanctions. I've seen it suggested that sanctions could be imposed on the Russian central bank, but what actual operational difference is that going to make? It could be a case of seizing the Russian assets in Europe. But again, there's been a huge amount of discussion about this, and the consensus, the legal consensus would be wrong, and it anyway looks like an extremely bad idea. Sanctions against Russian oil and energy exports are likely to be ineffective. Any attempts to enforce them are going to result in enormous problems for the United States and risk antagonizing friend countries that want to maintain good relations with the United States. Even if they can be enforced, they are not going to achieve the impacts on the Russian economy that many people assume. And if they are enforced also, and are in that respect successful, they will simply increase energy prices, and in that case, that will create further problems for the Western economies and for the economy of the United States. Now, on that topic, by the way, there's been some articles. I've seen suggestions that the current slowdown in the Russian economy is somehow an effect of the sanctions. It's extraordinary how people come up with these things. The Russian central bank has spoken about the current slowdown in the Russian economy. And I'm going to just repeat what it says. Now, this comes from Kirill Tremasov, advisor to Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of Russia's central bank. He says this: one scenario, which is now being called a soft landing, is a good one for the current situation. The upside scenario is that demand slows, the economy catches up with it, price stability is restored, and monetary policy is eased. We continue to move along this sustainable economic growth path. The negative scenario is where the Russian economy slumps, he means goes into recession, before returning to a balanced state. We are currently seeing a much bigger chance of the first scenario playing out. That is to say, the soft landing. A certain slowdown is a natural, absolute, normal process after 2 years of rapid economic growth. The choice now is not whether we maintain high growth rates or slow down. It's whether we slow down as price stability returns or inflation remains high, but we still slow down. So what Tremasov is saying is that the slowdown in the Russian economy, which is the product of the high interest rates and the tightening of fiscal policy, which we're now starting to see in Russia, that the current slowdown is an intended result of a policy that the central bank and the Russian government, and by the way, Putin himself, agreed upon last year in order to bring down inflation. And indeed, inflation is starting to fall. There were clear indicators to that effect in March. And meanwhile, the economy, by the way, continues to grow, but at a lesser level than last year. By the way, we have had figures about economic growth in Russia last year. They have, as I expected, already been revised upward. It is now believed the GDP growth in Russia last year was 4.3%, not 4.1%, as previously reported. So, anyway, in other words, an engineered slowdown in order to bring the economy back into balance and to bring price growth back under control. This is entirely conventional economic policy. Now, I say this, The Economist, all sorts of other people claim otherwise. They make all sorts of dramatic and extraordinary claims about what is happening. But the problem they have, which they never address, is that the Russians aren't saying this now. These important Russian officials are not saying this now. They have been talking about the need to do this since the summer of last year, when it became clear that the economy was expanding at a galloping rate and needed to be slowed down in order to bring inflation under control. The central bank, the government, Russian officials, Putin himself, are all saying that the policy is working. So, there we go. Further sanctions, it's not going to succeed. Military aid for Ukraine off the table. The one thing that further sanctions are going to do is that they're going to destroy any further prospect, or so it seems to me, of a US-Russia rapprochement, which will please the Europeans mightily, and it will ultimately also mean that Russian-Chinese relations are going to become even stronger. Because One country definitely is not going to observe American sanctions on Russian oil and gas, and that, of course, is China. The Chinese will continue to buy Russian oil and gas. In fact, they're likely to increase purchases, and not only increase purchases of Russian oil and gas, but they will want to deepen their relationship with the Russians altogether. And I repeat again what I said. I think there is a good chance that Xi Jinping, when he arrives in Moscow in a few days to attend the Victory Day parade in Moscow, one of the things he might do, and this is not a prediction, he might do, is sign some kind of memorandum of understanding for the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, or conceivably, though this might be a stretch, a final agreement. Anyway, there it is. That's where we are. So likely, more likely than not, the United States walking away, Trump ending arms deliveries to Ukraine, putting up further sanctions on Russia, saying a curse on both your houses, and moving on. I think that is far from being the worst policy the United States could follow at this time. The worst policy would be to continue to arm Ukraine and to revert to the policies of the Biden era, which went nowhere. But it is still, in my opinion, a weak policy. Far better to walk away and to press forward with an outright rapprochement with Russia. And I say that because a rapprochement with Russia remains overwhelmingly in the US national interest. The United States needs good terms with Russia to finalize the deal with Iran, which ought to be a priority. If the Russians turn against the United States and are refuse to work with the United States on the Iran deal, then it's easy to see how it might get unstuck, in which case Iran would not only retain its stockpile, but would already get further military supplies from the Russians. And by the way, I have recently obtained information, which I'm not going to disclose, about the extent of evolving Russian ties between Iran and Russia, and they are becoming very extensive. As I said, there's still very much to do, but suffice to say that there are already apparently Russian military personnel in Iran, though this fact has not been publicly disclosed, and I suspect that there will be more of them there over the next few months. Anyway, so destroying the relationship with Russia, terminating the prospect of a US-Russia rapprochement, leaves the United States in a worse position. As I said, the Russians further antagonized. The process of rapprochement with Russia ended. The Russians will still win the war in Ukraine with the many problems that will cause. The US would still have to maintain forces in Europe to counter the Russians. There are multiple reports that despite the huge increase, the further increase, I should say, in US defense spending, the fact that US defense spending now runs at $1 trillion a year, that's the size of the current budget. Budgetary pressures are will nonetheless cause a reduction in the overall size of the US Army, which, by the way, is not so big, not as big as many people think. I'm not talking about the US military, I'm talking specifically about the army. And there's talk that military units will have to be redeployed from Europe anyway in order to meet commitments in other places. I've been speaking since long before the conflict in Ukraine began about how the United States is overextended and faces an overcommitments crisis that is up against, faces commitments in the Middle East, in East Asia, in Europe, all at the same time, that it cannot keep up with all of them, that it is in effect in the early stages of a strategic crisis. That will not only continue, but it will get worse. The Russian-Chinese partnership will be strengthened, and, well, the President, Donald Trump, will have failed in his great objective to achieve some kind of reconciliation with Russia. Well, that nonetheless is what I think he's going to do. His economic war against China, contrary to occasional claims that you see in a few places, is not succeeding. There's all sorts of brave claims that Chinese stockpiles of copper are supposedly falling. Evidence for that, very limited. China, by the way, is one of the biggest producers of copper. So is Russia. So there is no difficulty. The Chinese will have no difficulty getting their hands on more copper. Claims that other countries around the world would cut trade deals with the United States, which would end their economic links with China, that they agree to sacrifice their economic links with China in order to forge trade links to maintain access to the US market. There is no evidence that any country, at least none that I'm aware of, has agreed to any such thing. There is an article today in the Financial Times, I believe it's by Martin Wolf, which actually makes the point that many countries around the world are simply not in a position to do that, because even though China might run trade surpluses with them, many of the goods these countries import from China are absolutely essential for the effective operation of the economies of these countries, and cannot be replaced easily, including by the United States. So the attempts to isolate China economically have been unsuccessful. And given that those attempts have been made, the attempts to isolate Russia economically, they will be unsuccessful as well. So to repeat again, this is a weak if this decision is the one that is going to be made, it is going to be a bad and weak decision. Not the worst decision that the administration could make. The worst decision would be to go back to Biden-era policies, but still a decision which does not ultimately resolve the underlying problems of the United States. I have to say that there is a huge paucity here of statesmanship right across the West. I've talked about the lack of good decision-making in Europe. Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, who I should say I count as a friend, and who we were privileged to do a program with on the Duran yesterday, has written an absolutely excoriating article on his Substack blog, The Peacemonger, about Britain's coalition of the willing decides that it's unwilling. He asks the question, why does Whitehall stumble from one idiotic idea to another? And he dissects this entire project about sending troops to Ukraine and points out how absurd it always was. And then he ends with this. what we do is we stumble with great self-importance from one idiotic idea to another, announcing them at every stage as huge breakthroughs in our collective resolve to defeat Russia, until the moment finally comes, with not even an ounce of self-awareness, we admit that upon reflection it won't work. What sensible person who analyses foreign policy in the theatre of the Ukraine war really did not predict the completely embarrassing 100-degree turn that has now happened? The fact that the British and the French are apparently no longer thinking about deploying troops in Ukraine. The jingoistic armchair Twitterati have gone remarkably silent, though I'm sure they'll find another foolish line to pursue soon to keep the guns firing in Ukraine. And I can say what that will be: further sanctions. Surely, which, by the way, Ian Proud, who knows more about sanctions on Russia than anyone else I know, including emphatically myself, has also said in this very same article that they won't work. And then he goes on to say, surely now we must find someone in Whitehall to engage their brain, pull on their grown-up trousers, talk to both sides in the conflict and reach for peace. And I agree. I think Trump did come to this whole prospect with a genuine intention to improve relations with Russia and to end the conflict. Objectively, putting aside humanitarian issues, doing so is in the US's best interests. I think he has that understanding. Unfortunately, he simply doesn't find the mirror of that understanding in Washington amongst pretty much the entire decision-making apparatus there. There are some other people within Washington who have glimmers of this. I suspect that his vice president might be one of them. Elon Musk, to some extent, might be another, and Steve Bannon also. But these are isolated voices. Overall, Congress, the bureaucracy, the State Department, where Mr. Wes Mitchell used to work, all of these people continue to see this conflict against Russia in zero-sum terms, as the United States somehow imposing its will on Russia, even though by now it should be obvious that it can't be done. Well, I don't know how this is going to play out. To repeat what I said in my program yesterday, maybe in the autumn, when the military crisis in Ukraine finally fully hits home, some more sober thinking will begin. I have to say that I'm far from confident that that will indeed be the case. I fear instead that what we're going to get are going to be cries again for escalation which can only make the situation more dangerous and which cannot produce any satisfactory outcome. But that, it seems to me, is where we're heading. Now, I haven't dealt with the military situation in any very great detail over the last couple of programs, but I will now say a little bit more about it to finish off this program. Firstly, it does seem that the Russians have now established a significant foothold in Sumy region, and that they are now inching towards the village of Yunakovka, which lies on the way to the city of Sumy itself. I still believe that it is not the Russian plan, at least not at this stage in the war, to capture Sumy itself, but of course I don't know. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I noticed that in its very latest reports about the fighting in Volchansk, Group of Forces North has been speaking about fighting taking place in forested areas to the east of the city. That suggests to me that the Russians not only are in secure control of all of Volchansk, at least north of the Volcha River, but that they are now moving beyond Volchansk itself. It's clear that there are still some places in Volchansk left to capture, but it looks to me as if that is only going to be a matter of time now. Much more dramatic has been the situation which has been happening in other parts of the front line. First of all, as I said yesterday in my program, the village of Kamenka, the important village of Kamenka, has been captured north of the Oskol, on the northwest bank of the Oskol River. Now, this could, in theory, open a way for a Russian advance way to the north to link up with Group of Forces North as they push south from Volchansk. I mean, that is possible. But it seems more likely to me that the Russians have been taking steps to enlarge and stabilize their bridgehead, preparatory to an advance south towards Volchansk, towards Kupiansk, around which they have now established quite a tight vice. Kupiansk is in a semicircle, and the Russians are about 1.5 kilometers, apparently, to the north of Kupiansk now. And there's already supposedly been fighting on the outskirts of Kupiansk, and supposedly, in fact, I'm sure this is true, Russian reconnaissance groups have occasionally entered some of the northern suburbs of Kupiansk, basically to get a sense of how strong the Ukrainian defenses are in this area. Events further south are becoming much more dramatic. Now, in the southern section of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, the Russian Defense Ministry today said that the village of Nova has just been captured, and there are reports a little to the further to the east in the Siversk area, which is also connected to this fighting, in the southern sections of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, that the Russians have re-entered the village of Grigorovka and might be pushing soon towards another village, Serebyanka, and they appear to be consolidating control of territory around the other village of Verkamyanska. Altogether, the Russians are now once again very, very close to Siversk. Of course, they have been close to Siversk before, but this time we appear to be looking at a concerted series of moves by the Russians, which look like they're going to soon, fairly soon, bring the position of the Siversk group, the Ukrainian Siversk group, essentially to crisis, probably causing the Ukrainians to withdraw from Siversk. Firstly, as I said, the Russians are pressing on Siversk from the east. They are also again pressing on Siversk from the north. Apparently there continues to be fighting in the village of Torske. The Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of Torske during the period of the Easter ceasefire, but the Russians have apparently re-entered the village. But more importantly, with the capture of Nova and with further Russian advances towards other villages a little further to the south, the Russians are coming close to a position where they would be in a position to strike and recapture the town of Liman, which they briefly held in the summer of 2022, but which the Ukrainians recaptured in the autumn of 2022. Now, if the Russians recapture Liman, and of course if they also capture Kramatorsk and Yampol, then Siversky's supply lines are cut off. And at that point, the Ukrainians will have to withdraw from Siversk. And this town, which has been a thorn in the Russian side ever since the fall of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk back in the summer of 2022, that thorn will finally have been pulled. The Russian position, in fact, close to Slavyansk, in the north of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, will have become very strong. And if Liman is captured and Kupiansk is captured, and the Russians are now very close to both of these places, and neither of them is very big, and both likely to be well defended, but their supply lines also look fragile. Well, if these places are all captured, if Kupiansk, Liman and Siversk are all captured, it's likely that the Russians will also be able to recapture Izium and Balakleya. And, well, at that point, the Ukrainian position in Slavyansk will begin to look critical. Now, all of that is a little in the future, though probably not very far in the future. But in the meantime, there is unquestionably a major crisis for the Ukrainians south of Konstantinovka as well. Now, to repeat again, the Russians claimed back in January that they'd captured Toretsk, south of Konstantinovka. The Ukrainians then spun stories that they were still fighting in Toretsk. They then launched various counterattacks against the Russian positions in Toretsk. The Russians defeated all these counterattacks, drove the Ukrainians out of Toretsk again. Toretsk seems to be entirely under Russian control. The Russians, since then, have been gradually capturing all of the villages to the west of Toretsk, which the Ukrainians still held, including various roads, various villages that lie west of the main road in this area. And most importantly, they also now look to be, and we've had much more information about this over the last 24 hours, indeed finally close to the capture of Chasiv Yar. Now, when I say the capture of Chasiv Yar, there are some suggestions that the central built-up area of Chasiv Yar could fall to the Russians over the course of the next 24 hours. And there are also reports that the Russians are now fighting south of Chasiv Yar in a village called Stupochki, which apparently is close to the main supply lines, and that they have also entered the two remaining micro-districts of Chasiv Yar, which the Ukrainians will struggle to defend. There are some suggestions that this long battle of Chasiv Yar could be over within about a week or so, maybe in time for the Russian celebrations on the 9th of May, though I would stress again that I have never got at any point during this conflict the sense that the Russians time their military campaigns around any political events, just to say. But anyway, that's the information from Chasiv Yar. If Chasiv Yar were to fall, then Redovka did a very interesting analysis of the military situation. To repeat again, Redovka is a Russian newspaper, so obviously they report on events from a Russian point of view. But Redovka said that if Chasiv Yar falls, then the entire Ukrainian defense position south of Konstantinovka will become untenable, and that the Ukrainians will be left with no option but to withdraw their forces into Konstantinovka itself, because trying to hold the ground south of Konstantinovka would risk placing the Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka into a cauldron. So one could see how, with the events around the Oskol River and with these events south of Konstantinovka, the Russians could be fairly soon in a position to launch an attack on Konstantinovka and on the other cities that make up the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. And of course, as the Russians have themselves pointed out, if they do control Chasiv Yar and indeed Toretsk, they will control all the high ground with all the advantages in terms of artillery fire and that kind of thing, which that brings. And, well, there's also been more reports about the situation in Pokrovsk and around Pokrovsk. The Russians continuing to advance, make advances northeast of Pokrovsk, but also doing so west of Pokrovsk as well. Now, there's been a number of reports in the media in the West, one in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, which again spoke about how Ukraine is now rapidly running through the ammunition supplied by Biden and perhaps by Erdogan from Syria, and that before long they will be very, very short of artillery shells again, that the Europeans are not in a position to replace the artillery shells that have already been used. I doubt the United States is either, by the way. And of course the Russians, as I've discussed in previous programs, are probably now obtaining shells, not just from their own factories, but perhaps from North Korea as well. I've had some information about this as well, by the way, which I might discuss in a future program. And this article, interestingly, finally acknowledged what is the obvious truth, that despite Ukraine's purported drone advantage, which is mythical, in my opinion, rather than real, if Ukraine is outgunned in artillery terms on the battlefields, then it simply won't be able to hold its positions. It will be forced into retreat, particularly given the manpower shortages which continue to afflict the whole of the Ukrainian army. Meanwhile, it's now suggested that the United States assesses that Russia recruits around 30,000 men for the military every month. Some reports say that, in fact, recruitment might be as high as 40,000 men a month. It's pointed out that many of these men are being deployed to new units that are being created in other parts of Russia, for example, on the Scandinavian, the Finnish and Norwegian borders, and who knows where. But the fact is that the Russians have no major shortages, either of equipment or of personnel, and obviously the military balance continues to shift to their advantage. So, lastly, I should say, I saw a Ukrainian report, which spoke about how when the green comes, in other words, when spring fully sets in over the course of May, the Russian offensive will probably begin in earnest, and that the Ukrainians are in a precarious position to deal with it. So that is the military reality. Zelensky, by the way, continues to talk about attacks on Moscow. At least that was my interpretation of his words. He spoke of the Russians ought to have concerns about the safety of the parade on Red Square, which, frankly, I found really unpleasant comments, but then what you expect from him. Anyway, there it is. But none of what's happened over the last couple of months, none of the diplomatic initiatives has brought us close, has changed the military calculus on the battlefields, and nothing can change it. As I said, come the autumn, we may be looking at a very different situation from the one we're looking at now. And as I said, that might be a critically dangerous point, though we might perhaps start to see serious negotiations finally take place then. Though by that point, the Russians will be presumably in a position to demand even more. And as we saw in the program yesterday, two Russian officials, Patrushev and Sheremet, are now bringing up the topic of Odessa. So anyway, that's my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.